This is the Humans of Gaming podcast, an open and honest conversation about games, life, and belief.
Hello and welcome to Humans of Gaming. I'm your host, Drew Dixon. I am the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd. Humans of Gaming is one of 3 podcasts currently in the Love Thy Nerd podcast network. And I'm joined, as almost always, by Chris Gwaltney. Hey, Chris.
Hey, how would you, are we the best podcast in the network? We're the second best, probably.
Yeah, if we say second best, then
just say second best, and we won't put them in any order.
Yeah.
So that way we're not hurting any feelings.
It'll sound like humble, but also like we're not the worst, at least.
Yeah. Hey, strive for mediocrity, and you rarely let people down.
What do you do at Love Thy Nerd, Chris?
Oh, I'm the chief executive nerd, so I don't know what I do.
That's basically a meaningless title.
Yep.
All our titles are basically meaningless. They just we just try to make them sound funny and / important.
Yep.
So that's it. That's what we do. No, Chris keeps us all in line. He's manages a lot of things with Love Thy Nerd. Keeps us all going, so I really appreciate Chris. And I manage all of our site content, including these podcasts that we do. I kind of oversee them. I don't have a lot to do with the other podcasts other than just making sure they're still going and stuff. But yeah, mostly the website content. So that's who we are. We have a special guest today, and that is Rachel Kowert. Hey, Rachel, how are you?
I am great. How are you doing?
I almost called you Dr. Kowert, and then I thought we didn't have that conversation of like what you like to be called.
Either way is fine.
Rachy Rach? How's Rachy Rach?
You can go. I mean, I feel like we know each other enough for that. So
all right. I shot for the moon on that one, and that worked out.
Worked out.
I just never know with like people who have higher degrees than I do. It's like, because you work so hard for that degree. Like, I think if I was in that position, I would want everybody to call me Dr. Dixon, at least for a while. But then my thought is also
maybe it wears off.
Yeah, after a while, you'd be like, well, I've been a doctor for long enough now that you can call me Drew. But maybe
it doesn't wear off. It doesn't wear off.
It doesn't wear off. So you got that degree, like, man, I earned that. You're going to call me Dr. Kowert.
Yeah.
I had an honors English teacher in high school. And keep in mind, like, I grew up in this kind of small town in Anderson, Indiana. I mean, it's not small, but nobody knows this town really. And she had a doctorate, and she demanded that people call her doctor. And if you slipped up, she would write you up and send you to the office.
Okay, well, that might be a bit much.
Yeah.
I think it seems fair. At least for a while, like, especially if you just got the degree, like.
She was about 100 years old.
Yeah. Okay, that is a little extreme.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Kowert, you wrote some great books about gaming that we want to talk about. That's part of why we had you on. You have a book that I've read called A Parent's Guide to Video Games that I've read cover to cover and used, and in fact, in talks that I've done, cited you. I didn't pretend it was mine. I cited you.
Awesome.
And some talks I've done on parenting and video games and interactive media, which is really great. And then you also, I think, co-edited the video game debate. Is that what it's called?
I did, yes.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah, so I'm a research psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology from the University of York, and I also have a master's in counseling psychology from Santa Clara University. I have been studying video games and video game effects for a little over 10 years, specifically focused on media effects, which maybe comes through with the books that I write.
Which is like basically 10 years is basically as long as we've been studying them. I think there was a good chunk of years when video games were around where nobody was really thinking about them very much. So You've been doing this, from almost kind of from the ground up, right?
You're a veteran.
Yes. I got there really when it started. When I decided to study this as a research career, there was about 2 or 3 papers in the entire field of game studies. And now there's hundreds, thousands. So yeah.
Yeah. What was that like? Like kind of being one of the first people to get in on this. Was that exciting to you?
It was very exciting. My interest in it, because I have my master's in counseling psychology, I was seeing clients who, at that point, this was like 2008. So this was the height of World of Warcraft, right? So I'm parents who
Yeah.
like it. I know, I played a lot too. Who were like,
Which is why people started studying.
exactly.
this field.
Exactly.
Thanks,
No,
Wow.
it was a push because parents were like, this game, what is it? They're playing it. And nobody knew anything about the
Yeah.
effect of it.
And so yeah, what were some of the first like studies that you did on video games and playing video games?
One of the first ones I did was about the stereotypes of gamers. My supervisor for my PhD, his work heavily weighed in stereotypes and the way we perceive groups of people. And that was really interesting because, again, it was at the beginning when online gaming was really becoming like a thing. And if you look at the way that they're perceived, people who play online games are viewed completely different from people who play like Mario Kart or people who play Dungeons and Dragons, in the sense that they're viewed way more negatively. If you World of Warcraft player is completely different from, any other kind of gamer. So that was really interesting. And then from there, I spawned off into looking at the effects that games are having, since they are viewed as being so much more antisocial and so much more inept in like every way. It's like, okay, well, are the games doing this, or is there something just unique about this subgroup of individuals?
Yeah. So the big differences between people who play Mario Kart and Mario and those who play online games are primarily perceived like the people who play online games. What are some of the common stereotypes that you saw?
Socially inept,
Right.
overweight. And most of the differences between them really lied in the area of being social. They don't have any friends. They don't want any friends. They can't communicate properly to make friends. So they play games online to make, quote on air quotes, fake friends. And that's kind of where they spend their time and why they're spending so much time online. And then, of course, the classic overweight, aggressive male. Lives in a basement, that sort of thing.
And you were actually like playing World of Warcraft when you did this.
I play tons of World of Warcraft.
Still?
More than I should admit. No, not now. I got kids. I have no time. But no, back then, hours and hours and hours. So yeah, it was fun.
What were your? Did you play every expansion? Were you more active in some of the other ones? I can geek out a little bit here with you, Rachie.
Okay. A Lich King is when I started endgame rating.
Okay.
And then after that, I kind of dropped off because after that, I started my PhD. And then, again, no, it's like having a baby. Your PhD is your first baby in my case. And yeah, no more time.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I played, I kind of go in these cycles with WoW where it's like, I sub for a month or two and just go off the deep end and then quit for a couple years and then do it again.
Yeah,
it's like straight up relapsing.
It's easy to go off in that game, but last time I logged in, it was like 3 years ago, and I was just confused. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
It changed so much.
Yeah.
What was the last one? Legion? Was that the one? That was a recent one, right? Expansion?
Isn't it?
Legion?
Is Legion not the new one? What's the new one?
Well, it was a couple years ago. Maybe
there's like one that just came out this year.
No, it's not that one. I played when the one before this first came out. That was the last time I played. But
people who are really into World of Warcraft are upset by this conversation.
Dude, the MMO, I just can't do that MMO life anymore. It's like, it is all consuming.
It is.
And you miss out. Like even Destiny, like MMO light Destiny is still like, you don't play anything else and you miss out on so many good things. I can't do it to myself anymore.
Yeah.
You quit playing Destiny, Chris?
Yeah. I don't play it anymore. I know. Big deal.
So you did this study on World of Warcraft while you were playing it. And I bet to a lot of people, they were like, well, why we can't trust you now? Because you did a study while you're doing
I would almost think the opposite. Like,
Well, in the beginning, it was actually quite good because there weren't many people studying it, and I had developed such a community from all my thousands of hours of playing it that works in my favor. But as time went on, I found that people who played MMOs started to get a little more animosity because then every person was trying to get in there and do research on MMOs and video games, and they were over it. But in the beginning, it was more fresh and new, and they were like, "Okay, I'll talk to you." Not so much anymore.
Yeah. So some of these stereotypes, like which of the stereotypes are true and which are not with online games?
Okay,
or are they all off?
They're all off. I mean, all stereotypes have a grain of truth, which is why they stick. So it's like, okay, online gamers are perceived as antisocial. Well, why are they perceived that way? Because the way we see them is they're in front of a computer with headphones on, but no one else is around them. But we know from research and from anyone who's played any online game ever that it's not an antisocial activity, right? You're connecting hundreds and thousands of other people. But the way it's perceived from the outside, from people who don't do it, it's like, oh, they're just on their computer alone in their room all night. So in some sense, I mean, all the aspects of the stereotype are true, and then they're also all untrue.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Super clearish.
Yeah. Nuance is not something we accept really well in our culture these days, I think.
It's the way of science, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
Life.
Yeah.
So you did that study, and then share about some of the other like meaningful studies and things you've done in this space.
Yeah, so my PhD evolved into looking specifically at the social impact of online games. So how playing online games, not just World of Warcraft, although again, at that point, the majority of online gaming did seem to be World of Warcraft, how it impacts our ability to socialize in terms of our social skills. So there's a lot of talk about online skills and offline skills, right? You play online games and you get leadership skills and then you bring them into the offline world or that sort of thing. So I was looking at, okay, if we play online games, are we learning new social skills? Are we losing traditional social skills? In some way over time, is it changing our abilities? And that sounds really grand, but the answer is meh, not really. There were some relationships which could be whittled down in the too long didn't read version of some people who play games are shy. The skills associated with like initiating conversation tend to be lower among people who play online games than people who play offline games or don't play at all. But other than that, meh. All kind of the same. And then don't really see any impact in terms of abilities. Now, if you look at the other research in the field in terms of your friendship networks and things like that, or how close you feel to your friends, those things do tend to be associated a little bit more. But at least we know at the end of the day, our ability to communicate when we're not online does not seem to be impacted.
So then raid leaders should not put it on their resumes.
Well, see, that's the other thing, though, because raid leaders, what they're using on their resume isn't their social skills, but their ability to mobilize and motivate groups of people, which there is quite a bit of research to show that does translate really well. So raid leaders, you can keep that, but but twist it towards leadership skills, not so much social skills.
So the lesson that you took from this is kind of like, well, people are people. And they're diverse, and some of them have issues with communication and social skills, and some of them don't.
Drew just summed up like a decade of your work.
You know how many like nervous breakdowns I had writing my thesis, and you just like, people.
Wow, Drew. Well, hey, Rachel, it's great having you. We'll see you later.
Yeah.
I think it's like that's sort of a joke when I said it, but I actually think there's something there that's like really valuable, just in the sense of doing the research, because you break down a lot of these assumptions that we have, which is really helpful if people will listen, to realizing that their assumptions are kind of like messed up and these things are not as scary as we thought they were.
Right. And that is true. And video games take a lot of flack for a lot of things, and it's important to just realize that they're just the latest in the long list of media to take flack for all the things, right? It was comic books and movies and television and rock and roll and blah, blah, blah. Now it's video games. And at the end of the day, honestly, at the end of the day, if you look at the wealth of the research in all areas of game studies, in leadership, in cognitive thinking, in aggression, in anything, it's far more positive, the effects, the negative. And at the very least, it's neutral. Okay, but we still have this idea that it's this horrible thing that's ruining your life, but it's not. It's media. The effects are almost zero if you look at it statistically over all the people who consume it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think. See, I imagine though, like some parents. Actually, sadly, there's probably not a lot of parents that listen to this that don't already play video games.
Not yet.
Or more, but I can imagine some parent hearing this. Actually, some parents will listen to this because I'll mention it when we post it, and they'll tune in. So, but I can imagine someone listening to this going like, but, and having like 100 questions.
Yeah.
As to why why they are concerned and why they think the impact of media, specifically video games, is much more concerning than what you just said.
Well, and there is reason for that, and parents, I understand. I really do. It's because video games are interactive, and I feel like that's the heart of all the arguments. So, like, okay, rock and roll and Elvis might have ruined a generation, but you weren't like actively walking around a fake immersive world shooting people when you were, whatever. That's what video games are to the parents of teenagers. So. Right. I understand your concern, absolutely, but I'm very much, and I can see where the concern comes from, because from standing again from the outside in, that seems like an obvious connection that someone would make. But if you look at the science and parents, really thousands of studies from some of the greatest schools all over the world, there are game studies centers all over the world, and they're not finding it. They're not finding these relationships. They're not finding anything to support it. When we see these headlines about video games and aggression, which we can get into later, again, these are short-term, immediately after, in a laboratory setting kind of thing. We're not finding any sort of long-term effect in any sort of negative possible box that you could study with aggression or social or even physical outcomes with obesity. Those links even, we're not seeing being any stronger than you would see with the use of anything else. So I get it.
Dude, I'm super excited to share this podcast with our parents. I just have so many parents in my church or my just local community that are, Fortnite, that's the buzzword. I feel like we should just put Fortnite in the title of everything that we do. And we'll get 50% more engagement.
Yeah.
But, hey, so, we're probably going to be talking about this parenting thing a lot with you. But I did want to take a minute to share one of our listener questions. So we have a group of people that, support us every month generously. They love what we do. They love thy nerd. I guess that makes sense. And one of the ways that we try to give back is to give them the opportunity to ask our guests questions. We have some cool people on here, like Rachel. And so we want to give the opportunity to ask some questions. So this actually comes from Jonathan Clausen, who actually produces this podcast. So I don't know if that's a conflict of interest or not, but here we go. So he actually wrote out a little fun scenario. This is typical Clausen, but here we go. So for the parent who says, "Oh, I don't understand how all this video game stuff works," and you can really tell it's because they don't consider themselves tech savvy, how would you approach them, or what materials would you direct them to make them feel more comfortable becoming engaged with their children?
That's a good question. It's a question that a lot of people have. If you didn't grow up playing video games and have children, I can see being at a bit of a loss when you see Fortnite. We're talking about Fortnite. My number one piece of advice for parents who want to know more about it, but don't necessarily, want to play it, is to spend time with your children when they are playing games. Now, I would recommend trying to play, even if you are terrible at it, it gives you firsthand experience as to what it is they're playing, because there's no better way of gathering information than doing it yourself. If my mom asked me, what do you do in World of Warcraft? I don't think that I could explain accurately what it is I do. But if she sat down and, ran around with me and died 100 times, she would get the impression of what it is I'm doing. There's no substitute for firsthand experience. Yeah. So be present with your kids, even if you just walk in while they're playing and say, hey, can I watch what you're doing? Oh, why do you like this game? Oh, this, that, and the other thing. You will learn so much about what your kids like and what they're playing.
Way more than you bargained for.
Possibly more than it depends on what they're playing. At your own risk, parents. This is at your own risk.
And they'll potentially feel cared for if
that speaks volumes.
Just ask some questions. Like genuinely curious questions, not just like, why do you like this game that's so stupid?
Yeah, no, exactly. Don't do it that way. When I was a kid, I played Mario, old Nintendo. And I remember my mom coming to play with us. And I remember it still. She died on the first enemy on the first level, the first world.
Oh, freaking Goomba, man.
But, I remember her coming to play, and it did mean a lot to me. My dad would never play. He'd say, oh, you're wasting your time on these video. So, yeah. It means a lot, even if you don't want to try. I understand some people don't, but just standing in the room and looking at it and watching and talking with your kids is a good way for you to feel more comfortable and to show interest in what your kids are doing. In terms of resources, there's a book. There's a book for that.
It's great too.
I wrote it. I wrote it for that exact purpose, because we have all this information kind of locked up in the ivory tower, so to say, of game studies academia. And I literally was just tired of waiting for the information to get out. I was getting questions from parents. I was happily answering them, but it's like, why do parents still not have this information that we've had for at least 10 years? So that's what the book is for.
That's such a good point, because I am like, I don't know if underwhelmed is the word, or shocked at the lack of, just as you said, there's that stuff that's kind of up there in the ivory tower, but for your, average quote parent, what is there for them? And as big as the industry is, it is so big, that we don't have more for parents. Clausen, the guy that, edits this, and we asked that question, he's a manager at a GameStop. And I mean, he just has these horror stories of parents coming in that are just clueless, and whether that's their fault or not, it's just the reality. And man, I'm just really glad that there are people like you, and that we have books like that and some resources at least that we can point parents to, because it's super, super needed.
It really is. It really is. And I don't know why there isn't more, really. Like, I just wrote it out of frustration. I had no time. I just had my daughter, and I was like, but you know what? This book get written, like, someone needs to have this information.
Yeah. Well, and that's so you mentioned this earlier, but there's so many misleading headlines that come out, and I don't want to get political or whatever, but our president, after the shooting in Florida, he's like, oh, we need to get to the bottom of this video game violence stuff, without even really looking at any research, obviously, or just kind of spews it out.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of parents, it's really, they feel like they see those headlines, and they feel like they don't have the time to really look into it that carefully themselves. And so it's just, the easy thing is just to, set your anxiety level a notch or two higher and get worried about it.
Yeah. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah. But just to give our readers an example of what you cover in the book, here's from the table of contents: chapters on addiction, in Dr. Kowert's book, Addiction, Aggression, and Violent Crime. There's a chapter on cognitive development. There's one on physical and mental health, one on social outcomes, one on sexism and misogyny. So addiction, violence, sexism, and misogyny, those are all the concerns I have, like as a parent, about my kids engaging with this medium. And the cool thing about it too is that it's 100 pages. So, and like in those 100 pages, there's graphics, there's a bunch of pull quotes. It's really visually nice to look at, and none of the pages are very long, and there's tons of like great statistics. They're easy to digest. So all that to say, like, I think you did a great job of taking this thing that feels like complex to a lot of people and unapproachable, and just like, I don't know how to get to the bottom of this whole video game thing, and made it really easy for parents. Like, you could sit down and read this in an afternoon or less.
Oh, thank you.
And step away, you know, with a lot better with a lot better bearings on this issue, and feeling like, okay, I know how to help my kids with this, and I know what not to be scared of, which is like really important in this day and age, is to you know, knock down some of those walls of things that we're worried about, and have our anxiety be a little bit more manageable.
Yeah. And I think it's important too that I didn't want to create a book that just had information, but also had actual practical advice at what this information actually means, like for parents and for their children.
Dude, parents are strung out. I'm not a parent yet, but like, I mean, you guys can speak to this, I'm sure, but especially parents with like younger kids, you know, preteen, that kind of age, like they just can't handle a 300-page dissertation or whatever. Like,
right.
You give them a 100-page picture book, and
right.
They know picture books. They got kids, so
that's right.
Makes sense.
Pictures are key. Jim did a great job. And I should also note, as an academic, writing in brief is very hard. I worked very hard to be not long-winded.
Good on you.
Yeah. I bet that was harder than it would have been to write like a 300-page thing about the same subject, because
yes.
Yeah, it's hard. I know it. I'm a writer too, so I know how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about like the two big issues, I think, that and maybe we have time to talk about sexism and misogyny too, but I think like with parents, especially, the things that they're worried about nowadays are addiction, number one, and then violence, number two. Maybe just violence because it kind of came back up, like we mentioned earlier this year, just because, you know, our president got on Twitter. But it's still something. It's still something parents worry about. You know, I still get questions about it. So let's start with addiction. We talked about this over email, but you know, a few months ago, the World Health Organization came out and decided to include gaming disorder in their International Classification of Diseases, the 11th edition that's coming out soon, I believe. Well, you know more about this. Frame this for us than for our listeners, I guess.
The World Health Organization made a move in their they have a diagnostic manual. It's similar to the one that psychologists use. We use the DSM, which is produced by the APA, at least in America. But this is like an international version. And they added gaming disorder as a list of diagnosable, official mental disorders. And this was kind of groundbreaking because they are the first organization to do so. Currently, the American Psychological Association, who I mentioned, produces the DSM, which is what the psychiatrists and the psychologists in North America use, have internet gaming disorder as something listed in the back as a topic that requires further research. So they are not committed either way, as maybe it is a disorder, maybe it's not, and they're specifying it to internet gaming. Whereas the WHO just said, okay, here's gaming disorder. This is a thing. We're going to recognize it now. And here are the criteria. And it's caused a lot of waves in the field, I would say.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I've seen some people that were pretty, like, there's some papers I think that came out. One, I think I saw that like 30 research psychologists contributed to, that said they disagreed with this classification. What did you think about the decision?
I lean on the side of those 30 psychologists. Those are all some of my colleagues, well-respected colleagues. didn't like the decision because, again, I don't think there is enough research to indicate that it is something distinctive enough to merit its own classification. If you look at research that's been done on people who use games pathologically, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Surely there are people who use games in a way that hinders all aspects of their lives, which is kind of the general idea behind an addiction. It's causing them distress in, occupationally, socially, physically, what have you. But if you look at this small subset, and it is a very small subset, some say as small as 0.8% of all of the gamers, the gaming tends to be an outlet for something else underlying: depression, anxiety, PTSD, whatever it might be, another kind of mental disorder that's driving it. And the games are just the outlet. It's not the use of the media itself that is then causing other forms of distress.
Yeah.
So that's important, because I think some people here, because this is how it works. Like, people here that listen to this podcast are like, oh, she plays World of Warcraft, so she's a gamer, therefore she's going to defend this medium. You know what I mean? And it would discredit some of the things that you're saying. But I think that's stupid. But I just know how people think. But what I think is really helpful about what you just said is that what you're concerned about is you want people to get the right kind of help. You're not saying video games aren't a problem in some people's lives, or that nobody has an unhealthy relationship with them. What you're saying is that if we assume that it's the games without realizing that more often than not, it's some other underlying issue, then people don't get the right kind of help.
Exactly. And to those naysaying parents, I actually went into this work thinking I would find negative outcomes. There were so many parents coming to me saying, my child is now X or my child is now Y. And I follow the numbers. I really don't have, an investment either way. If the number said it was terrible, I would be telling you that. But the numbers don't lie. And they're not going to get the treatment that they need if they're showing pathological behavior. And now we're pathologizing what could be considered normal behavior. So when I was a child, when I got that new Ninja Turtles arcade game, I don't know how old you guys are. Am I
I remember it. You're right in. I remember that. That was a
sweet spot. Yep.
That was elementary school for me.
Yes.
So.
Yes, best Christmas ever. My brother and I played that for hours and hours and hours on Christmas break. Now, we went back to school. Everything was fine. We got good grades. We were functioning adults. But now, if you see that, a parent comes in and says, oh, well, they're playing, 10 hours a day, or they're not sleeping. Well, did they get a new game? Yeah. Well, is it Christmas break? Yeah. Okay. Well, is that really a problem? I don't know. But if you look at this criteria about addiction, you'll say, oh, but he's not calling his friends, or he's not sleeping properly. And it's like, okay, hold the phone. It's not a problem yet.
Yeah. Which is, that's really, and I think something you said a minute ago too is really helpful. I think there's this cultural perception that it's a huge problem just because we all know. We know at least one horror story, or we know somebody who we suspect is, but just because they're awkward or something, we're like, that person must have an issue. But in reality, it's 0.8% of, somewhere in there, 0.8% of all gamers who would be clinically classified as addicted.
Right. And I think, if you are concerned, if you know someone who you think might have a pathological relationship with games, I think the one important tidbit to remember is once it starts causing problems in every aspect of their life, every aspect over a long period of time, I think the WHO said 6 months or more, that's when you might start to think, okay, maybe this is a problem that's playing out its way through playing games. Maybe they have anxiety. And, it might not necessarily be bad, because Fritz called games emotional self-medication. So people who maybe are socially anxious, maybe they're using these games as a way to overcome that anxiety. So it's not necessarily pathological if they're playing just a lot. It has to be like they're losing their job and they're failing out of school and they're not eating and they're this and they're that for a long period of time.
Yeah. we recently interviewed Jamie Madigan, and we talked about this issue of like coping and that how games can actually be helpful to cope with anxiety, and like games generally make people feel good about themselves, which can be really healthy for kids at times in moderation. But we were talking about how, Chris and I were talking about how in Christian circles, that's like sometimes amongst some like conservative Christians, that's like a sinful thing or something, like how could you shouldn't use a fantasy video game where you're doing fantastical things, maybe even violent things, to like feel better about yourself, like that. You know what I mean? Like they feel like that's almost like idolatrous or something, or whatever. I'd be curious if you've run into that kind of like, because I think like we should, in general, as human beings, be glad that our kids are connecting with something that makes them feel better about themselves. Like that seems like a good thing to me.
Yeah.
Personally.
I mean, I'm a fan of using the tools that you have at hand, and if video games, and if you look at the research, they are great tools for giving children opportunities to lead groups that you normally wouldn't get to meet people all over the world that you normally wouldn't meet. I mean, stranger danger, of course, but you know what I'm saying. I have not come across that. I have talked a little bit before about maybe the moral decision making in terms of how that relates to like spirituality and religion in playing games. But in terms of like it being a tool itself, I am very much a fan of you use what you have and you use what works. And if that's something that's having a positive impact in your life, that's awesome.
Yeah. I think maybe it's like tied to this fear that like if you use games to cope with anxiety and stuff, then like you won't be able to, I think there's like this fear that you won't be able to function responsibly in the real world or something like this. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I mean, there's nothing to suggest that that's true that I've seen.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
We have the answer then.
There you go.
Boom, roasted.
No. Yeah.
One thing that I do want to say about the subject of addiction is that in your book, you give, I think, 7 criteria for addiction. And I think you mentioned that you have to observe these things over a period of, what is it, like 6 months?
I think it's 6 months, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but you also said in the book, like, this doesn't mean that you just like sit on your hands and do nothing while during those 6 months, if you have kids or something, right? Like if you're seeing signs of an unhealthy relationship with your kids, like, hey, you're a parent, like go love them and parent them and set some boundaries and ask questions and help them engage more responsibly.
Exactly. And by asking questions, as we talked about earlier with the question from the producer, sit with them, talk with them, look at the game. Hey, why do you like playing this game so much? Oh, because I get to, hang out with my friends, or I get to feel what it's like to, lead a group to success, and at school or at work, I don't get that opportunity. Like you don't know what outlet the games, what it's feeling. It's not just from the outside in, oh, he's running around Vice City. I'm aging myself. I'm sorry.
Vice City, yeah.
People still talk about that game, I think.
Yeah, deep cuts.
Yeah. So, Vice City's shooting people. That might not be like what they're getting out of it from playing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's important for sure.
I need new references. Vice City. Oh my goodness.
Red Dead Redemption 2, running around Valentine.
There we go.
There you go. So we talked a little bit about addiction. I think that's really helpful what you said. Let's talk a little bit about violence because it has come back up. In fact, I just pulled up this article I came across a few weeks ago. Here's the headline. This is from the USA Today.
Can't wait.
From USA Today. It says, study confirms link between violent video games and physical aggression.
Nope.
And nope. Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to just like help us out here?
No.
So I think this is referring to like you may have looked at this, but a meta-analysis of several studies, of like 24 studies, right?
Yes. Okay. So,
Have you looked at this study before or recently?
yes. So the studies
Okay.
that find links between video games and aggression, they are 99% conducted in a lab where you bring a person in, you take a measure of aggression, and it could be anything. A very common one is, I mentioned it in the book, the word completion task, where you see like KI blank blank, and okay, I go in there and I put KISS, okay, kiss. Then I play 15 minutes of some kind of violent game, and then I take the same
Vice
measure,
City.
Vice City. We play a little GTA, and then I see the same measure, and now instead of putting kiss, I put kill, right? And then that's flagged as, oh, that's an increase in aggression. So these studies that do that and do find that, okay, before and after play, I say kill instead of kiss, and they calculate their results and they say, okay, there's a slight increase in aggression. And then they do that 20 more times and they publish 20 more papers about it. And then they do a meta-analysis about it and they say, see, look. But if you look at the magnitude of these effects, they are very small. They're significant, but they're not substantial, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also no link between finding this in a laboratory and how people engage with other people in the real world. Patrick Markey and Chris Ferguson published a book, I think this year or last year, called Moral Combat, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, you should definitely get it. It's so good. And focuses specifically on looking at aggression. You know, school shooters play video games generally 3 times less. When people play video games, violence generally decreases. The vast majority of scientists do not agree that games are a risk for aggression or violence. Now, these don't make headlines because they're not so, I don't know. They don't make headlines. They don't make news. They're boring science stuff, right?
Right.
But that's the truth. That's the truth.
Yeah. I think I read that Dr. Markey, who you mentioned earlier, he said less than 1% of the variance in aggression is explained by exposure to video game violence.
There you go.
So it's like, so the headline, I guess someone could play devil's advocate and be like, well, the headline's technically true.
Yes.
Right, but what kind of figure are we actually looking at? Whereas less than 1% takes takes us down from DEFCON 5, right, down to like DEFCON. I don't know. I'm not going to give a figure, but much lower, DEFCON, right? No, I don't think people see DEFCON much anymore. But I remember it from what was that movie? The War Games. Did y'all see that?
Oh yeah.
That's what I always think about.
Speaking of video games.
Yeah, that's a video game movie deep cut.
Yeah, I was about to say we're really in the deep cuts now. Yeah, it's so true. But yeah, you're right. It is technically true, but again, it's like even if people thought that less than 1% is an important variable, which I would argue is not really. That it's again in the laboratory and not in a real world setting. So what does it really mean? Like even if we want to take that 1% as something valuable,
Yeah.
I think that's really important distinction because I'm a layman. I don't think about that. Mm-hmm. But I think you just saying that, like, hey, this just happened in a lab. Like, there can be value in that, surely, but we still have to take it with a grain of salt. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And if the studies that have found it too, Chris Ferguson, and I think possibly he published this with Malta Elson. I'm not 100% sure on that, but Chris Ferguson definitely published an article looking at these studies. And when you consider other psychosocial variables, previous exposure to violence, their frustration tolerance, personality factors, this, that, and the other thing, the effect of media completely disappears. That 1%, even that 1% disappears. Mm-hmm. So all these other factors are far more influential in determining if someone is going to be aggressive or violent in an actual real world setting than if I played the new Red Dead Redemption. There we go. Our references are getting better. Remove it.
Current.
And so I do want to clarify, though, for our listeners, too, is that, like, what we're not saying, too, we're not saying necessarily that your kid should go out and play Red Dead Redemption 2.
Correct.
Like, I'd be curious what you would say, like, some advice for parents with regard to violence, like, No, it's probably not going to make your kid like hyper aggressive, and they're not going to go to school and punch other kids. But what? Yeah, I don't know. What advice do you give parents when you talk about this issue?
I very much am a fan of children not accessing what I would call inappropriate content. So I can't tell you how many times. I'm sure that I forgot your producer's name, but he works at GameStop. I'm sure he's seen this, where parents go in and they're buying games rated 18 and older for 8-year-olds.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Don't do that. That's my advice. Read the packaging. And it's not just the age, because there are age ratings on all of the games, no matter where in the world you are listening to this podcast, they're on there. But there's also content placards that tell you why it got that rating. Is it violent? Does it have suggestive themes? Is it because you can be online? You look at all this stuff, and then you determine is it appropriate for my 8-year-old. You know, my daughter, she's 4. She plays a lot of like PBS games, but you know, if she wants to be like, hey mom, I want to play Grand Theft Auto, I'm back with that. But you know, no, you're 4, right? That's not appropriate. You're not going to go do that. So you know.
Yeah, and there's more resources today than ever before, really, on that subject. Like you can go to ESRB, that's our rating system here in the States. Peggy actually, I think, has even more detailed. That's the UK one, but we get all the same games. So if you want a more detailed list of what's going on in games, go to Peggy's website. You know, and also like we have a guy who writes for Love Thy Nerd occasionally. His name's Andy Robertson. Do you know him by chance?
I do not.
He does like this family gamer TV channel on YouTube where he does reviews for parents and stuff.
Nice.
And he's got a whole like Patreon thing. He works really hard to like inform parents in like a helpful way, you know. And not in an alarmist way.
Good.
And so anyway, one of the things he always tells people is like, hey, go watch some Let's Plays, like get on YouTube or Twitch. Like you want to see what's in this game, you can actually watch a few minutes of somebody playing it. And then, you know, if you turn on a stream of like, I don't know, BioShock Infinite and people are jabbing saws into people's skulls, then you know, hey, that's not like, you know, it's not what I want my.
You may want to play it with your 4-year-old.
And you're so right. Twitch is a great untapped resource. You know, when Fortnite was getting real popular, I did a couple interviews about it. You know, I don't have time to play Fortnite. I watched it on Twitch, a lot of it, and it was very informative. It was like I was playing. It was great. Yeah.
You're like, hey, now I'm an expert on Fortnite.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So read the labels.
Yeah, read the labels.
I'm curious, like, does it bother you that, like, the overabundance? I feel like people are talking about this less than they used to, but for a while, even amongst, like, video game critics, there was a talk about how, like, there's just an overabundance of violent games. Like, that's the primary verb in a lot of, like, violence is the primary action you take in a lot of games. Does that bother you? Do you wish games were more diverse on that subject?
I would love to see, I'm a numbers gal, I would love to see the numbers on that if that's necessarily true. I know a lot of the ones that come from big studios, right, AAA studios, are games, Red Dead Redemption, right, that's a big game right now. But there are plenty of games that don't have, I mean, look at The Sims, right? The Sims has been going on for decades now. Every still have expansions. So I don't think that games, the big budget ones, do tend to, but that's the same for movies. I bet it's the same trend for movies. You know, the Batman movies.
1,000%. Yes.
So
me and speaking of that, my wife and I were looking through Netflix last night. You know, the dreaded find a new show to watch on Netflix. And we're just kind of in this mode of like, we've just watched a bunch of like really heavy, you know, TV, violent stuff. And we're just kind of like, we just want something lighthearted, but like, you cannot find it. I mean, you just go through there and like, everything is just this heavy, gritty, dark, you know, just, whoa.
Well, maybe it just reflects the times, you know?
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. Sad.
Yeah, sadly.
Yep. Well, that took a turn. Sorry.
Well,
I think that there's like there is probably a bent in that direction, but not probably. It seems like it seems pretty clear that there is an overabundance of that. But at the same time, I appreciate what you said, because a lot of people's interaction with video games is they play some puzzle games on their phone. Like, those people are gamers, and those games are actually super popular.
Yeah.
It's just that we think that like gamers are so territorial sometimes. I think we assume that like Red Dead Redemption and Call of Duty, and that's like that's video gaming. But I'm trying to think, like The Room, or oh gosh, what was that one? The really like beautiful meditative kind of
Journey.
No, oh well, yeah, that's a great game too. But I'm thinking the mobile one, where Monument Valley. That's what I was trying to think of.
Oh yeah.
Like, those games are massively popular. People love those games.
Yeah, there's something for everyone. There is. I mean, maybe it just makes the headlines. Like Call of Duty. Oh no, what is this horrible game that just came out? Yeah, I haven't played the new Spider-Man. It's probably violent, but I heard that game was really good too.
It's violent, but you can't kill people.
Oh, see? So there's at least that.
Spider-Man, like right before like someone hits, like if you knock someone off a building, right before they hit I haven't actually played it, but somebody wrote an article about this for our site. Like right before they hit the pavement, Spider-Man will shoot a web and like save them so that the police come get them. So he's like,
good guy, Spider-Man.
Yeah, doesn't believe in the death penalty. He's got some.
Way to go.
So yeah. Well, we've talked for almost an hour, gosh, and we usually like to get a little bit personal, hear the story of our guests. So we have a little bit of time here to do that. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in Texas, in North Texas. It's called Kowert.
Okay,
Not many people live
Kowert.
there. Yes, it's bigger now. Okay, now it's got a movie theater. When I was there, when McDonald's came, that was a thing. That was an event.
Yeah,
it was a small town.
So, like, is that north of Dallas? Like, when you say North Texas?
Yeah, it's closer to Fort Worth. It's like east of Fort Worth. Yeah.
Okay. I grew up in Amarillo, which I feel like is like technically North Texas.
I mean, I guess it is.
But nobody, by Texas geography speak,
that's not
it's
north.
Technically, it's West Texas. That's what everybody in Texas would know. That's West Texas. And Dallas, that area.
That's North Texas. Yes.
Yeah. But anyway, so you grew up there. What was your upbringing like? What did your parents do?
My dad worked for IBM for like ever. He worked there when they had the computers that took up the whole room with like the punch card.
Yeah.
Old school. My mom stayed at home. She later became a massage therapist, which was good for me. But as a child, she was home with us, and she worked part-time at a church. I did grow up in the church in Texas.
Okay. So, is that where from your dad working for IBM and stuff? Is that where you got your love of like video games and technology and stuff?
No, I think it more came from my brother. I have an older brother. He's 2 years older than me. But my parents did buy us a Nintendo. So when Nintendo came out, I guess my dad, it was his love of technology that got him to buy us a Nintendo, which I guess he later regretted since he thought it was a waste of time. But my brother was always the one who would bring the new games. He introduced me to Final Fantasy, which is now my favorite franchise of all time. He's the one, introduced me to World of Warcraft, for better or for worse. So I guess I'll give him the credit. Now he's going to have to definitely listen so he can see that I'm singing.
So that's interesting to me that your dad worked for IBM, being nerdy into that stuff, but was not. I feel like that's a little uncommon, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it probably is. It probably.
Maybe some of that generational stuff too. Like, I feel like your dad, I assume, would probably be like a baby boomer. Is that right?
My dad was older, so maybe that's why. He was the generation before.
Okay.
I don't know what they're called, but yeah.
Well, baby boomers and the generation before, like, they're all kind of like a little bit skeptical of new hobbies.
Maybe.
So it's like, you know what I mean? I don't know.
And I think too, he's like, I work with it all day. I don't want to.
Oh, yeah.
home.
yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So your mom worked in a church. What kind of church did she work in?
A Lutheran church. She worked in the office. It was a church down the road from our house, and we grew up there.
Like doing administration and stuff?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Cool. So you grew up Lutheran then?
I did. Yes, we did. In the same church.
Did you?
Our whole childhood. Yeah.
Did you like the church? Were you into it? Or was it?
I mean, as a kid, you're like, oh, it's boring. I mean,
Yes.
I did like Vacation Bible School. We did that every year, and then I enjoyed that. And the church, like knowing now, I guess it's very traditional. Like the
Mhm.
women couldn't be, hold positions of power, and
Right.
everyone wore a suit, and we sing like the old, like the oh no no those. And now it's funny because when I go to church, like now that's what I prefer. My mom's like, "What's wrong with you?" I'm like, "I guess it's because that's what I grew up in." And it's almost like morose, the hymns aren't.
It feels like comfortable to you now.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I can see that. I get annoyed these days by I live in Nashville, so it's like Bible Belt for sure.
Yeah.
Like area, and there's tons of churches. And so when we moved here, we were like visiting churches, and every church here, because it's Nashville, Music City, right? Is trying to have this like super cool worship, like rock band
Right.
kind of thing. And we're kind of like, could we just like sing some hymns
See?
awkwardly,
Awkwardly. That's important. It has to be awkwardly.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So you still go to church then?
I do not go to church.
Okay.
I consider myself religious, but I'm not actively going to church. I married someone who's not religious, so that's
I see.
that's a thing.
So that was kind of like a compromise, or you just kind of felt fine, kind of phased out of your life, or
Oh, we are getting personal. No, I mean it's fine. It was a compromise in the sense that he is my high school sweetheart, so I've known him for ages. And I said, look, I'm religious. Our children will be baptized. I will probably start taking our children to church at some point. You don't have to participate, and that's fine. And that was the compromise. And he's like,
there you go.
I don't have to go. I was like, I'm just telling you, you're not going to fight me on it. It's just, it's a thing.
Yeah, that sounds like the compromises my wife and I have. Yeah.
She tells you what to do, and you say, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way it works. That's a good marriage. That's a good marriage.
Yeah. It's funny that you say we ask these kind of questions so often. I forget that they're personal. So I appreciate you being like, "Oh, we're getting personal." I have to remind myself that these are kind of personal questions.
That's fine.
But no, that's cool. So what do your like? So you said the church you grew up in was kind of like traditional, kind of conservative.
Mm-hmm.
So what do people in that space like? Are your parents still around?
Yes, they are.
Okay. What do they think about like the work that you do?
Oh boy.
It's a funny joke. Okay, it's not really a joke. It's actually happened. When I graduated, my brother's a lawyer. My dad, worked at IBM, but he's also ex-Marine. So my brother's a lawyer. He's in the Air Force. So, golden boy. When I graduated, I was like, Dad, you have a doctor and a lawyer. Aren't you so proud? And he goes, you're not a real doctor. I was like,
oh no.
Wow.
Why? We know where he stands.
Did he mean like you're not
a medical
doctor? A medical, yeah.
Yeah, but still. I think he thought it was funny, but it wasn't that funny. My mom's
there's a lot of things dads think are funny that are not.
Dad jokes, they're yeah.
But that's like that's a
I know.
That's
that one's stuff.
That's a doozy.
Yeah, but my mom is very proud. She reads all my books, even though the Parents' Guide she understood. She actually read my dissertation, or at least she says she did.
Ooh.
I know, so that's love. She's got to be proud to do that.
Yeah, that's big.
Yeah.
There's not many people's dissertations I would read.
I don't even want to read my own, and I wrote it. Yeah.
So has your dad come around a little bit? Like, does he see the value in what you're doing?
I don't know. I think he thinks it's cool that I have a PhD. He does. I don't think he really understands it because he has like zero exposure to video games. And my dad, like I mentioned, is older. He's 77. Yeah. So he's not like, those old light box thing. I don't think he knows what I do.
Right.
But
So I don't know if you ever think of this because I'm in a very similar situation with my parents and like their understanding of what I do. Do you ever think like, how does your dad describe what you do to people?
I imagine she has a PhD in psychology and does something.
Yeah.
I really don't think I don't.
I have no idea how my parents would explain what I do. Because like also my parents aren't like Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that part is already weird for them.
Right.
And then add on top of that I'm like, you know, doing this nonprofit gaming kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, they probably just don't even talk about me. They just probably gave up.
They're like, he talks to
Maybe.
people.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's funny.
Anyway, I just think about that. We can commiserate. My dad's also a retired Marine.
So you get it. Yep.
Sorry, Drew, we alienated you.
Oh, no, you're good. My daughter came in the room and I had to mute the mic for a second. So parenting, you know, my parents, just to give my perspective, my parents, I think they actually do know what I do in this space. They've been pretty cool. My dad probably knows less about it than my mom does. I do remember like one time my mom reading a couple articles that I wrote. Like she read something I wrote about BioShock Infinite.
Oh wow!
And then then she wanted to watch me play it.
Oh wow!
And so then I
remember you talking about it.
I sat down to let her watch me play it. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, this is awful!" Because it is pretty like graphic.
It is.
Right.
Like if you live in that space, you think it's fine.
Yeah.
And you're used to it. But yeah, it is pretty like gruesome if you're just watching. I think it's worse if you're watching than if you're playing. Because if you're playing, then it's like, you know why you're doing it. You're just doing it to like progress to the next level or to get past this area or to get a power up or whatever. You're not actually thinking like about the awfulness of it. Whereas the person watching is like, oh my gosh, you just stuck a hook in that guy's skull.
It's just just a normal day at the office.
There you go.
Yeah. But hey, we're kind of out of time here. We told you an hour and want to honor that. But this has been awesome talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we mentioned this also to Jamie Madigan, who we had on a little bit ago. And eventually, I think I'd like to do like a roundtable discussion on addiction and on video game addiction and kind of what responsible engagement of games looks like.
Nice.
Especially
we talked too about like an escapism kind of thing because I think that
that's right.
Word always has like really negative connotations, and so I'm really curious to kind of talk about that and hear both sides of it. Like when is that good? I mean, we talked a little bit about that during this show, but I think there's a lot more to be talked about with that.
Yeah, I think Christians are sometimes, especially, are like a little bit afraid of the idea of escapism. Like something bad's going to happen if you escape too much, or you're not going to engage the real world responsibly if you're escaping into video games too much.
Right.
So anyway, all that to say, like those would be cool topics to have some smart people like you and Jamie Madigan on to talk about. So maybe we'll like put together some kind of roundtable
and he said you guys were BFFs.
We're friends. We are. I can't believe he doesn't know how to pronounce my last name, but other than that.
I said that earlier. I don't think we were recording when I said that. But it's a joke. I just said I called you Rachel Kowert, and then you corrected me to Kowert, which is the correct pronunciation. And I just mentioned that Jamie didn't correct me when I said it that way.
Wow. Love him. It's fine. We go with
He's the worst, actually. We're going to rescind the invite.
No.
Well, it was really informative talking to you. I would highly recommend people go check out A Parent's Guide to Video Games, as well as the Video Game Debate, which you helped edit. Anything else you would point to, the resources that you might want to let people know about?
If you are really interested in learning more about the link specifically with aggression, I would definitely check out Moral Combat by Chris Ferguson and Patrick Markey.
That's such a cool title.
It is, and it's a really good read, and it's easy to read. Anyone can pick it up. You don't need to be a scientist. You don't have to have a PhD to understand it.
Nice.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. And then you can be found online where?
I can at rkowert.com. So it's rkowert.com. Everything is there.
Great. And are you active on Twitter? Would you want to mention that?
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Kowert, and Facebook and all the places that you find all the people.
All the social medias.
Search for Dr. Rachel Kowert. You'll find me.
Great. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I want to mention a few things to our listeners. Be sure to go check out our website, lovethynerd.com. We have a whole podcast network. There's Free Play, which gets into all kinds of aspects of nerddom, and is super fun to listen to. They're a lot less serious than we are. It's a really funny podcast. Go check that one out. Also, we have a new comic podcast called The Pull List. So, Love Thy Nerd Podcast Network is growing, which is super exciting. Those guys do a great job of kind of digging into the meaning and value of comics in a way that I don't think anyone else is really doing. So, go check that one out. What else, Chris? Give us money. We need your support.
There's got to be a better way for us to say that.
I know. I mean,
get down to it,
just the reality is we put a lot of work into this podcast, into Love Thy Nerd, and these things don't pay for themselves. That's just the reality. If you believe in what we're doing, we'd love it if you would
help us do it. Do it with us.
Yeah. That's it for us. Thanks so much for listening. Go rate and review our podcast on iTunes, tweet about it, Facebook about it, put it on Instagram, put it on Snapchat. What else is there?
That's quite enough.
That's it. Okay. Periscope. Nobody does that anymore. But if you do,
I've never even heard of that.
It was like a video thing that was kind of a big deal for a while, like a live video thing. Anyway.
Good talk.
Yep. Good talk. Rachel, thank you so much. Dr.
Thanks, Rachel.
Kowert, we appreciate it. Kowert. I almost said Kowert again. Dr. Kowert.
Thank you.
I reverted.
She's never coming back.